My instructional unit was designed for a section of ELAC 5043, Research Writing in the STEM Fields. The students are international graduate students who are looking to build their academic and research writing skills. One of the complicating factors of this particular project was that it was supposed to kind of meet a dual purpose. The instructor wanted me to design it so that students at the beginning of the semester could take this unit, but in this implementation, the students were already close to the end of the semester, so it needed to be adapted so that it would be suitable for them as well. The topic for this unit was synthesis writing. Here's a visual of my model. It's a model designed for a complex task. It has analysis, it goes to designing assessments, then a task analysis, then to the design of subtask modules. Then everything is put together within an events of instruction document, and then finally execution, where the materials are developed, the instruction is implemented, and evaluation takes place. So the model's built on a backwards design approach in which from the beginning of the design process, you identify what the end goal is, what you want students to be able to do as a result of the instruction, and you identify an assessment task at the beginning. Then that assessment task is used to guide the rest of the design of the instruction. It also incorporates a whole context approach or a whole task approach. Essentially, when you're dealing with a complex task, there's a lot of subtasks, sub-skills, contributing content that's involved. And instead of focusing on the pieces of the task or the pieces of content, the individual skills in isolation from each other, you present the whole task or the whole context to the students from the beginning. It also incorporates some chunking or segmentation to reduce some of the cognitive load that comes along with these complex tasks. When you combine both a whole context approach with this chunking or segmentation, it looks a lot like the whole part whole model that's described by Knowles, and also the pebble in the pond model that's described by Merrill. And in my particular model, when we get to the events of instruction, you'll see that in the introduction, that's where the whole task is demonstrated to the students. Then it moves into some part practice, where the students learn and practice the parts of the complex task. And then at the end, they perform the whole task. So it starts from a whole, moves to part, and then ends at whole. It also builds in, or it has the possibility for multiple iterations. So you can see in this model, it has 2 iterations that are included in the events of instruction. And basically, the last iteration is the most complex iteration. It's your end goal. What complexity level are you hoping for them to be able to handle at the end of the unit? And then what you can do is you can go backwards depending on where the students are starting out and reduce the complexity in previous iterations. So I'm going to walk you through the process of how I used my model to develop my unit. Started off with the analysis and did a learner analysis using the model from Dick, Carey, and Carey. I learned some important things about my students that helped guide my design. For instance, they had already covered APA citation, so I didn't need to spend a lot of time teaching them how to do that. They were hard workers and fairly independent. They actually preferred independent work to working in groups or doing large group discussions. Next, I basically identified the goal of the unit formally. Students will be able to synthesize ideas and information from multiple sources into a written product. And then I identified time constraints for the implementation. And I learned that I pretty much just had a 2-hour class period to do this unit in. Because the students already had so much homework for this class and other classes, the instructor didn't want me to assign something outside of class for them to do. So everything that I wanted to get done, I needed to try and do in a 2-hour period. Next was designing the assessments. So first I had to determine what complexity level I wanted to target. And so for a synthesis task, I needed to ask myself, how long should the written product be? How many passages should they be trying to integrate into the writing? How long should the passages be? Should I identify the subtopics for them or have them do that? What citation requirements would I have? What language requirements would I have? So I determined 300 to 500 words, 5 passages. I wanted the passages to be short rather than full-length articles. The students would be responsible for identifying subtopics. I would provide them with a reference list with reference citations, but they would be responsible for the in-text citations, and there would be a minimal language focus in terms of reporting language for synthesis. And then next I needed to decide how many iterations that I would have when I implemented this unit. And because of the time constraints and because of the complexity level that I would be starting with, I decided that a single iteration was pretty much all we'd have time for, so there would be no benchmark assessments. Next, I needed to write performance objectives for the task. I wanted to make sure I addressed behavior, conditions, and criterion. And since we only had one iteration, this was for the final task. And from this written description of the final task and what they were supposed to do, I developed an analytic rubric that addressed all the criterion and kind of gave a guide for grading and feedback. So we can move on to task analysis. In task analysis, I took that assessment, that final assessment task I identified and made the rubric for, and then I broke it down into its sub-steps, along with any prerequisite skills and knowledge that they would need in order to complete these steps. Using that, I developed a process worksheet. So here's the process worksheet. It's one of the learner supports that's part of my model. And this is a guide that they can use throughout the whole process as they walk through the task. Then, from the process worksheet and from these steps identified in this process worksheet, I developed subtask modules. And each subtask module needed to include a process worksheet, a reference to the process worksheet, which I ended up not including because it was pretty redundant. It needed to include supporting content. I needed to identify any supporting activities I would use to reinforce that content. And in this unit, with the time constraints and with the level of complexity that we were targeting, it turned out that I didn't need those. I took those out as well. And then part practice, which would include different forms of learner support and opportunities for feedback. Okay, so when I had identified everything that should go in each subtask module, I started putting it all together in a planning document, an events of instruction document. So it has an introduction section, it has iterations with the subtask modules and their components, and then the assessment task at the end. And then the final phase is execution, starting with development, where I kind of wrote out the materials, I recorded a screencast, I designed and created the handouts that would go with the lesson, and then I set everything up on my blog, all the materials that they would need, and the feedback is actually built into the site. Then for the implementation, before I had the students do it, I ran through the unit myself, make sure there was no bugs or problems. I made hard copies of the handouts for students just in case they preferred to work on paper rather than reading the documents on the website, and put a link on Blackboard. Okay, and then as far as evaluation, I had the rubric that I developed for the final task. I wanted to include student surveys to get reaction level responses, reaction level evaluation. I made a teacher interview, and then finally, because I had an opportunity to actually be in the class when it was implemented, I made an observation sheet that I could take some notes on. So, strengths. First of all, I was really glad that I included the analysis phase because it really informed and guided my design. There were things that I probably would have included that would have been unnecessary, that would have wasted the students' time because they had already done it. The whole format worked really well. I got a lot of good responses from the students and from the instructor on the way they were able to see the whole task modeled in a screencast before they started the unit themselves and worked through the steps themselves. The systematic approach of this model, and that everything was laid out, first you do this, then you use that information to do the next step, I really feel like that helped contribute to a very well-organized unit. The students were able to move through it really easily. They didn't run into any problems. It seemed to go really well, and it helped me kind of organize myself and go through a process. I never felt overwhelmed, not knowing where to begin. Finally, one of the things I really liked about this model was the inclusion of task completion as one of the learner supports. So basically, when students did the part practice, they were, for instance, making a synthesis chart, which is one of the sub-steps. I would actually complete part of the chart for them, which, number one, it gave them a model to kind of see how they could start out, what it should be looking like. And number two, because we had these time constraints, it really helped speed up the process without sacrificing that whole context approach that I wanted to keep in my model. Weaknesses. Biggest weakness of this unit was that the students didn't have time to finish it. They ran out of time, and pretty much none of the students were able to do the final task, and a lot of them didn't even finish step 4. So this actually led to my second major weakness in my model, was the evaluation. I relied really heavily on that final task to determine whether the students had achieved the objectives. So without that final task, I had no level 2 evaluation. And I also realized that I had no way to kind of compare how they did on the final task, if they had been able to finish, with how they did on the practice activities. Knowing what they were able to do with some scaffolding and some support might have been really useful interpreting their performance on the final task. Kind of to go along with that, I didn't have any pre-assessment included when I developed my model. So even if the students had done really well on the final task, I really had no idea of knowing whether it's because of the work they had already done previously in the semester or whether it was because of my instructional unit. And finally, some of the parts of my model were a little bit too rigid, at least in their wording. There were parts where I said each subtask module has to have component A, B, C, and D. So for instance, I intended that at the beginning of every subtask module, I would explicitly refer to the process worksheet. That didn't really seem to make sense when I actually developed the module. It seemed unnecessary and a bit of a waste of time. Another thing I was supposed to do was to introduce them to their final task assessment before beginning instruction. But when I was designing the unit, I introduced them to the final task, but then immediately after I introduced them to the guided task that we were going to be doing together, and they didn't really do anything with that final task. It was just kind of sitting there, and then suddenly we're changing direction. So the flow really didn't work well doing that way. I think I'd probably take that out. And all in all, I think the model could incorporate a little more flexibility and give the instructional designer a little bit more autonomy in making those decisions, instead of just saying, you must have this, you must do this here, you must do this here. I think it's a good model, but with a little bit of flexibility, I think it would work even better. Okay, that's it for my presentation. Here are the references that I noted in the theory section, and thanks for watching.